Hi everybody, welcome back to English 116, and this is for our class for Monday, the 7th, where we are getting close to putting some closure onto our short story section. I wanted to prepare us for the upcoming drama section. Now, dramas are longer than short stories, so we will be reading and also watching fewer dramas than what we've done in our fiction section, but they will be, of course, longer, so you want to plan ahead. And what I suggest to students is ideal, though I understand that the world isn't always ideal, is that when we are scheduled to discuss our first drama, that you would have read it in its entirety, so that when we begin discussing that drama, you are at home reading the second drama, and ultimately, when we are discussing that second drama, you are at home reading that third drama. So it makes sense to you because you've read the drama in its entirety when you watch performance and also when we discuss text. And there's similarities and differences, obviously, between the two. So I will include a link here to our first drama, which happens to be Oedipus the King. We still have to talk a little bit about why it is that we're reading such an old drama, 430 BC. Obviously, we're reading a translation because it would have been written in Greek. So there are, of course, challenges with any kind of translation. And we will watch a performance, and the performance we will see is going to try to duplicate what we would have experienced in Greece in 430 BC. And then we'll talk about the text itself. So the sooner you can begin reading Oedipus the King, the better off you are. My hope at this point is that you have finished reading everything in the fiction section, or you are close to it, so that you can begin thinking about paper number 1. And as you know, our first paper is going to be devoted either to the film we started the semester with, Citizen Kane, or with some of the fiction short story sections that are fiction short stories that we read after Citizen Kane. So we began by reading A Sorrowful Woman, and then we moved forward and reread The Story of an Hour. And then we talked a little bit about A Rose for Emily. And then we moved forward to discussing Young Goodman Brown. And I teach a face-to-face class of this particular course. They're a little bit behind you, so what I wanted to do is to try to get both classes to match up. So that would mean that we would talk about Soldier's Home today, and then we would finish up next class by discussing the last two short stories that I have scheduled in our short story section. The first being Battle Royal, which I'll talk a little bit about today. The second being Popular Mechanics. As you know, there are rolling deadlines for the first paper. You can hand in the first paper at any point, but my hope is that you would have submitted it in by the 21st, which is a Monday, which puts us midway through the semester. It is a critical paper, approximately 4 to 5 pages. So we talked about how critical papers don't rely on outside sources. You're basically focusing a critical paper on your own analysis and your own interpretation. And in terms of thinking about how to go about constructing a critical paper, the question is whether or not you're going to be writing about film or are you going to be writing about short story, because you will want to use quotation for either one, and that means that you use quotation marks, and immediately after the quotation mark we indicate usually the page number of that particular quote. Now, of course, if you're working with film, you don't have the page number. This is where you would use a timestamp instead. This is called the MLA, or the Modern Language Association, a series of rules for documentation. We call it parenthetical documentation. That immediately after a quote, you are in parentheses indicating where that quote appears. Of course, the system gets a little bit more complicated as you begin to add layers to it, so that if you are using multiple sources and it's unclear where that quotation is coming from, you're going to need to put additional information in those parentheses, perhaps an author's last name. And if you've got multiple texts by the same author and it's unclear which text you're referencing, well, then you have to add more than the author's surname. You're going to need to put part of the title. The way all of this works is that at the ending of the paper, you write a works cited page, and that lists all of the works you've literally cited or quoted from. And they're all organized in alphabetical order by author's last name. And this is where you put the detailed information about the sources that you used, things like publisher and place of publication. And there's slightly different standards for how you would list a book, let's say, as opposed to a magazine article, as opposed to a website. And basically what you do is you look it up much like you would look up a recipe in a cookbook. The MLA will tell you how you go about citing a magazine article, let's say, which is slightly different than citing something like a website. And then you just follow the way you would in a recipe, exactly what the MLA tells you about what order to put those pieces of information in and where to put punctuation and so forth. I'm hopeful this is something that you talked about in your previous English class, English 101. But you can see that I've got some examples below of how to go about quoting. And that said, page number or timestamp will probably be more than enough for a reader to understand what you are referencing, because I'm not asking for outside resources. This is a critical paper, so you should be relying on your own understanding of the text and what you've learned in class. So because of that, and because in theory you've gone through how to use the MLA in your previous English class, I'm not going to require you to submit in a works cited page. That said, if you are going to be submitting in a works cited page, then you may want to make sure that you're doing it correctly. And certainly if you are referencing outside sources, you have to include a works cited page. We talked a little bit about the conventions of writing papers, and I had suggested a couple of websites. The GCC website is very good, especially because the library website is well aware that you'll be writing papers. And yes, there are different systems for writing a paper, let's say in the sciences. That would be known as APA, or American Psychological Association, as opposed to MLA, Modern Language Association, which is devoted to the humanities, and that includes languages. The idea is that you're using the correct system for the correct discipline so that you don't want to mix them up. I highly recommend Purdue OWL, which comes out of Purdue University. They have made their website accessible to the public, so you don't have to be a student at Purdue in order to access their information. And it goes through the entire writing process, from generating ideas to finally handing in the final copy and everything in between. And in terms of our purposes, the first paper can be rewritten for a higher grade, because I see the first paper as a kind of learning exercise. Obviously, at the very beginning of the semester, we talked a little bit about how to write papers and generate ideas. I had some readings from the text that were unfortunately not included for free online. Usually, I've just been able to find the actual pieces of literature for free online. But there is a copy of the text on reserve in the GCC library if you don't have access to a text. That also reviews that as well. But the whole purpose of the revision is to allow you to actually practice writing a paper. So in terms of your submitting in the paper, I ask that you submit it in via PDF to my email. This is how my grading program works best. My email is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And I will evaluate that in terms of grammar and mechanics and content, and put a letter grade on it. You'll remember in your syllabus you have some information about the distinction between an A or an excellent paper, which has very few errors in originality of thought and is using transitions and connections between ideas, as opposed to a B paper, which is a good paper, but it probably draws safe conclusions, and sometimes the connections might be a little bit strained. You might see a few more errors in terms of the writing with grammar and structure. as opposed to a C paper, which is satisfactory. So you've satisfied the requirements of the assignment, but the organization can be strained and there are patterns of errors now in writing, as opposed to a D paper, which is basically struggling, less than satisfactory, with satisfying the requirements of the assignment, but you still have a grasp of the assignment and you've made some attempt to satisfy those requirements, as opposed to an F paper where now you've got frequent errors in writing, organization, structure, and there isn't really a clear or coherent thesis. But again, you can put all of this into practice by creating your first paper, which is what today's attendance question is going to be about, because I wanted you to begin thinking about writing paper number 1. And the question is going to be, thus far, which story do you think you might write paper number 1 on? And it could be the film, and why? And you're not committed to this, so certainly you can change your mind. And if you don't know at this point in the semester, it's okay to say, I don't know. But we are very close to putting some closure onto our fiction section. So if you don't know yet, you should know very soon in terms of thinking about your paper. And as you know, I've given you some sample paper topics that were related to the idea of either canon, those works considered by scholars and critics worthy of literary study, for you to determine whether something should or should not be included in the literary canon, or to talk about contemporary relevance, which is also an element of canon, but it's not necessarily the sole criteria for canon. To talk about a text that we've examined this semester, and by text I mean film as well, that you think does or does not have contemporary relevance. And obviously, regardless of the topic that you choose, you need to focus on the text itself, and you need to focus on evidence from the text. And I've deliberately chosen questions that don't have right or wrong answers, in part because what I'm really most interested in is your reasoning and your thinking. So in terms of the pieces that we have yet to discuss, we've got 3 short stories. One is entitled Soldier's Home, which I wanted to talk about today. That'll put us right on the same schedule as my face-to-face class. And then upcoming, what we have is Battle Royal, which I'll briefly talk about today, and Popular Mechanics, which is a very short story, just about a page and a half or so, but quite a powerful short story. So Soldier's Home, even though it was written quite a while ago, it probably has a more contemporary feel than some of the other pieces we've read, such as Young Goodman Brown. And we're talking about the early 1900s, then we're talking about World War I, and we're talking about the experience of what does it mean to be a soldier who is returning home as a veteran after his service. And at the time, it would have just been male soldiers. And while we use terms such as PTSD, that term hadn't even been invented at the time, was known as shell shock. And while it might not be too surprising, some of what we're reading in this class, in some ways, or in the story, in some ways it was revolutionary for Hemingway, who was involved in the war himself, to talk about how the veterans who are returning are still damaged and still searching for some sort of understanding and some sort of a support. The time, serving in the military would have been portrayed as one's heroic duty, and that once one was done, one could return home and return to normalcy, whatever normalcy happens to be. There is a famous quote, by the way, in the book I Am Legend. You might have seen the film, which is different from the novel, by Richard Matheson. And I love this quote, that normalcy is a majority concept. Normalcy is a majority concept. So basically, society determines normalcy. And for Krebs, who is our main character, who is returning, of course, he's searching. And notice that he's referenced so often as Krebs, his surname, which is how he would have been referenced in the military. Again, a way for Hemingway to show that Krebs is still in the war, even though he's returned home. The central question of the text is, what is the difference between a home, a place where you're loved and understood and welcomed, and a house. And definitely Krebs is back to his physical structure, but he's not necessarily home because his family doesn't really understand him. And also of interest is that Krebs in German means cancer, and one could say that the war is like a cancer itself, is that it continues to spread and can kill, which is what we see Krebs struggling with, the ugly reality of war, as opposed to the way it might have been portrayed in his society. And Hemingway is a master with giving detail that's important. So at the very beginning of the story, we're told about two photographs. And one photograph is about Krebs, and he is in a fraternity. In some ways, fraternities could be said to be similar to the military, in that everyone is supposed to be the same and wear the same outfits and so forth and so on. And then the next picture is of Krebs at war, and we're given very detailed information that the Rhine doesn't show in the picture, and that the uniforms are ill fitting, and that the girls are not pretty. And this is very important because it's an ironic deflation of what the romanticized version of war should be. That you go to the military in part to see the world, but in this picture with Krebs, the Rhine doesn't show, which is a tourist attraction. They're too big for their uniforms, so the uniforms don't fit, which I think is important twofold. The first, perhaps they've outgrown the conception of the romanticized version of war, and also that the military is not necessarily providing them with needed supplies. And again, one of the ways the military was sold to veterans at the time is that you could be attractive to the opposite sex. And again, considering the time period, that was the only suggestion that was given in terms of relationship. And the girls aren't pretty. So we see the reality as opposed to the romanticized version. Krebs understands that as he returns back. Civilians don't. In fact, they believe that he's returned too late, after the greeting of the heroes are over, as if it's possible to have a timeline as to when it's appropriate or inappropriate to return back from combat. Obviously, Krebs' service would have been just as important as any other veteran's service, but this idea that the community is not giving him the welcome that he deserves, that other soldiers have received, and that the community either is not interested in his stories, or they're bored by his stories, and they're either not interested because the stories are too gory and individuals don't necessarily want to know the details, but they're bored because they also don't necessarily want to hear that a lot of the time nothing happened, or as I'm fond of saying, they want a PG-13 version of what war is, and they don't necessarily want reality. And the result of this is that Krebs disengages himself from everything and everyone. In many ways, we could say that Krebs is continuing to fight battles at home rather than in the military, with other people, with society, even within himself. We see how he does question religion, and considering the fact that he went to a Methodist college, considering the fact that religion is important to at least his mother, one would assume that religion had been part of his life. But it makes sense that he would question religion after being in the war, because, again, the question of is there a God and would God allow these atrocities to occur seems quite valid. Krebs also questions the idea of whether or not he can reintegrate back into society. His parents are very clear that they want him to get a job and settle down and date. And all of this is considered to be, quote, normal, unquote. But Krebs isn't ready. And of course, this is a complicated piece, as all literature is complicated, because obviously Krebs is going to have to reintegrate and become a productive member of society. Yet, how is he able to do so if he's not experiencing any kind of support? And that's really the crux of the thing. He spends his time in solitary activities. He is playing the clarinet, for instance. He's reading about the war, no less. The idea is that he's unable to escape the war. And this is where Krebs is getting his validation. He was told he was a good soldier in the reading he's done. He's not necessarily getting that validation from other people. Even something that seems as simple as playing pool has some literary significance. Not only is pool a game which you can play by yourself, but in pool you aim and shoot. And of course, in the military, that's what you do as well. You aim and shoot. But in this instance, it's a gun rather than a ball with a pool cue. So Hemingway is very, very deliberate about his use of detail. Krebs is known as Harold by his mother. This makes perfect sense because obviously they have a closer connection. Krebs' sister calls him Hare, Hare, which means rabbit. And there could be lots of parallels between the idea of a rabbit and Krebs, where Krebs could be seen as being skittish like a rabbit or hiding in a hole like a rabbit. And I know that the dialogue, and Hemingway is pretty dialogue heavy. It's one of the reasons why it's usually easier to read a Hemingway, even though his piece is almost 100 years old, as opposed to reading something like Young Goodman Brown. And of course, the language is more contemporary too. But nevertheless, that dialogue that Krebs has with his sister when she asks, "Will you be my beau or will you be my boyfriend?" And he says, "Sure, I will." And I know that might raise some eyebrows, and you're questioning whether or not there's something inappropriate going on between them. And no, there's not. It's more of a question of hero worship of the very young sister who admires her brother. Perhaps she's the only one who does in the family. And ultimately, Krebs knows that nothing serious can come out of this. He can't really date her or marry her, which is fine by Krebs because he continues to say that he doesn't want consequences. Consequences were something that he experienced in war, the consequences of life and death. So, of course, he doesn't want the consequences of a job, and he doesn't want the consequences of a romantic relationship. And throughout the text, it talks about how he likes to look at women, but he doesn't necessarily feel comfortable reaching out to them or having any kind of relationship, despite the pressures that his family puts on him. And then, in fact, he liked the German girls. And it makes sense that he would like the German girls because the German girls probably didn't speak any English, or if they did, it was limited. So there was less of a possibility of any kind of emotional intimacy, which is what he's trying to avoid. And that's why he doesn't want relationship. When his sister asks for a relationship, he can pretend to be her beau. Yes, he can watch her play indoor baseball because it doesn't come with those kinds of expectations. And if we're talking about relationships, you may or may not notice that Krebs never has any direct conversation with his father, which is quite telling. It shows the level of distance between the two of them. And we don't know if this distance existed prior to Krebs's return, but it certainly does now. That basically the mother serves as the translator, the intermediary between the father and Krebs. And we know that ultimately, the parents even try to offer Krebs the family car, and a car represents things like freedom and independence and trust. And Krebs doesn't want the car. It's because the price is too high. I'm not talking about auto insurance here. Is that Krebs is very well aware that the car, which he was not allowed to use prior to war, comes with strings. That the idea of him having access to the family car means that he could work and he could get a relationship and he could settle down, and he's not willing to pay that particular price. It almost seems like an offense in some ways to offer him a car, as if now he's an adult. He's probably more of an adult than anyone in that family, certainly his parents, after what he's experienced with the atrocities of war. And as we see Krebs struggle, with trying to deal with his mother, who insists that he pray. At one point, he even says that he doesn't love anybody, including her. And of course, he tries to backpedal and say that, he was just kidding. But again, the idea is that love requires consequences, and it requires sacrifice, and it also requires vulnerability. And Krebs isn't willing to do any of those things, or is unable to do any of those things after what he has experienced in war. So he basically, at the ending, he decides to relinquish and ultimately do what his family wants. So he's going to get a job. he will be watching indoor baseball, which is his sister playing. He will allow his mother to pray for him. Um, and the question is this a victory and that he's willing to ultimately try to reintegrate into society? So this is positive. Or is it negative because he's merely doing what other people want him to do? Um, Probably a little bit of both, which is one of the reasons why these pieces of literature are so realistic, is that they have a level of depth and complexity to them. And the fact that Krebs is going to Kansas City to get a job, we could see it as running away and not trying to solve his problems with his family, or realizing that this is the best he's going to be able to achieve in an impossible situation, that he is not going to be able to change his family. Therefore, he's going to put at least some physical distance between himself and his family so he has the opportunity to heal and to move on. And sadly, this story still has so much contemporary relevance. If you think about the struggles that veterans experience in returning home in 2024, and we have a much greater understanding. So, the idea of tackling this subject in the early to mid 1900s would be considered to be bold. And Hemingway himself was an ambulance driver in the war, and while we need to be cautious by not assuming that authors are giving their biographical history when they're writing, one would assume that their biography helps to inspire the creation of their art. So when we hear about the battles that Krebs fought in, they were some of the bloodiest battles that occurred. So again, the idea is that Krebs has seen and experienced a great deal. And while his mother says that she understands, it almost reminds me of the husband in A Sorrowful Woman, that she understands up to a point. She certainly wants to be supportive, and doing things like making him meals, which again reminds me of A Sorrowful Woman, is supportive, but not necessarily the support that Krebs needs. And we can't necessarily blame her or the family because they don't have necessarily the resources or the understanding to provide those resources, to provide that support. And again, we can perhaps blame Krebs for not being able to articulate his pain, but how much can we truly blame him when he doesn't know how to articulate his pain? Again, lots of similarities in terms of A Sorrowful Woman, with the goal, I think, for audience members or readers to read this and to not be pleased, but to want to have some sort of change in their society so that this cycle doesn't continue. And we might say that there has been change in our society so that things aren't necessarily as dire as they were for Krebs, but there's still a long way to go, as we can certainly acknowledge. So those are some of the points that I wanted to address with Soldier's Home. And you can see that the pieces that we're reading are doing more than just trying to entertain and to provide escapism. They usually have some sort of social message. You don't necessarily need to agree with that social message, but you need to be able to identify what that social message is. And it was the same with Citizen Kane. While it entertained, there were also lots of themes and messages embedded within that particular film, and that all of these pieces deserve rereading or rewatching because that's where you really get a sense of the detail. So if you read Soldier's Home a first time, once you read it a second time or a 30th time, obviously each time you read it, you're going to be able to get more nuance from the text itself. And that said, when you think about the fact that Krebs' sister has a nickname for Krebs in a way that the other family members don't, I would use that as a piece of evidence in and of itself to show that they have a closer relationship, because usually you use a nickname with somebody when you have some sort of a connection, something that his mother is not able to do. But of course, she calls him Harold, so that illustrates the more personal connection as opposed to being referenced as Krebs throughout the piece. What's upcoming, the first piece that I wanted to talk about is Battle Royal, because it's actually quite interesting in that it's from a novel entitled Invisible Man. Now, we don't have time to read a novel. If we did have time to read a novel, I would have assigned Invisible Man. In fact, it might be the best novel ever written, in my opinion, which is high praise. And the problem with Invisible Man is that it's over 400 pages long, so I didn't really see how that was realistic. I say it's one of the best novels I've ever read, if not the best, because it's able to maintain that level of detail and symbolism that we expect from a short story where every single word has to count. But it's able to maintain it throughout a novel. Now, the good news is that its first chapter, Battle Royal, was published as a standalone short story, and that's what we are going to be reading for class, Battle Royal. But I can tell you that Battle Royal makes more sense in the context of knowing the story as a whole. So I'm going to tell you the story of the entire novel so that next class we can talk about Battle Royal and popular mechanics and just put some closure onto the fiction section. Do understand that this is a very superficial summary of Battle Royal. But Battle Royal begins with basically a character who calls himself an invisible man, and that he feels he's invisible because of his ethnicity. He happens to be black. And that he's only seen based on his skin color and not his individuality. Now, this piece, while it still has some age to it, you can see we're getting more contemporary. Now we're talking about the 40s and the 50s in the United States, the 1940s and the 1950s. While it has some contemporary relevance in today's world, it would have had even more relevance during its time period where just racism and discrimination was much more overt than it is in today's society. And that's not to say that it's not overt in today's society, but even more so during this time period. This character talks about how he's broken into the basement of an all Caucasian neighborhood where he would never be allowed to live because of the color of his skin. There were laws in place to actually exclude him. And that said, he's in this basement and surrounded by darkness because it's a basement. But he also has rigged up all of these electric lights. Electricity is a major theme in the novel. And he's stealing the electricity. In fact, he's stealing power. That's a major theme in the book, is who has power and how do you get it. So he's surrounded by both darkness and light. And the book oftentimes talks about contradiction. And he says that he needs to tell us how he learned that he became an invisible man. And it started earlier in his life, when a good 20 years earlier or so, when he had just graduated from high school. And that's what the first chapter is that we're reading, when he had just graduated from high school. So this is a coming of age novel where we have an adult narrator looking back onto their past. And this is where we get the story of Battle Royal, where our narrator has just graduated from high school, and he talks a little bit about how he needed to learn that he was an invisible man. And the way he learned was that after high school, and in fact, he had given quite the speech at his high school graduation, so much so, it was so respected that he was asked to deliver this speech to the leading citizens of the town, which is what he's doing in Battle Royal. What he learns, however, is that he needs to undergo a series of degradations and humiliations before he's allowed to give his speech. He is literally set up to fight a boxing match with his peers. And throughout, we hear about all kinds of horrors and atrocities that occur. And then after that Battle Royal, he's allowed to give his speech. And as you know, by reading the short story, as I've assumed you've done, that he makes a misstatement. And he says social equality instead of social responsibility, which puts everything to a halt. And he has to justify the fact that he said that, and he claims it was an error and it wasn't what he intended, and that ultimately he is rewarded after fulfilling his speech by being given a scholarship to the leading, quote, Negro, unquote, college. And yes, the N-word is used in this piece. And Invisible Man, our narrator, who's never given a name, which is going to be important, so he's never given individuality, much like a sorrowful woman, is thrilled. And he does have a nightmare, though, at the ending of his grandfather. And we learned about his grandfather earlier on in the story, that his grandfather had died, and on his deathbed said he was a traitor in the enemy's country. So we'll find out what that means next class when we talk a little bit more about that. But anyway, the nightmare is that he is at a circus. His grandfather refuses to laugh at the clowns, and that his grandfather, it gives him a message to read. It's an envelope within an envelope where he's told that he'll be kept running. And yes, the N word is used. So that's the short story. I wanted to fill you in on the novel, the first couple hundred pages or so, where Invisible Man does go to college. And he finds out that any hope he had of being accepted or being respected is an empty hope because of the racism that exists. And therefore, this was an empty dream of education, and he realizes that that is not the answer to getting equality for someone like himself. So he spends the next couple hundred pages working with the political system, trying to change the system that exists, and he comes to the conclusion that that too is an empty hope, and someone like himself will never be given opportunity or will never be given respect because of the color of their skin. And then he meets a character named Ross the Destroyer, which is quite telling because this person really is a destroyer. And Ross the Destroyer convinces Invisible Man that what they need to do is to start revolution and to basically have riot, burn everything down, and start afresh, which is what they do for the last 200 pages or so. And what Invisible Man realizes is that's not the answer either. He's only hurting other people, and especially his community. So what Invisible Man does at the ending of the novel is that he breaks into an all-Caucasian neighborhood and goes into a basement that is filled with darkness, but he steals power by hooking up all of these electric lights. In other words, the novel ends the way it begins. And Invisible Man says that he is hibernating at this point, now that he's tried education, politics, and revolution, and none of those things were the answer. And that's how the novel ends. And in other words, hibernating suggests that eventually there will be an awakening and there will be some action taken. But we're never provided with that action by the author, because ultimately the responsibility is on us as reader to find the answer to racism and also sexism, which is something that is addressed in the first chapter as well. Understand that this is a very superficial summary of Battle Royal, but it does give you an idea of what the novel is as a whole. So as you are reading the short story, it'll probably make a lot more sense in that context. And then Popular Mechanics, which is very short indeed, known for being written in a minimalistic style. So less is more in this instance, but you will definitely see how it ends with a punch. So with that said, I'm going to leave you with the question of, ultimately, thus far, which story do you think you might write about for paper number 1 and why? And you can certainly say you don't know yet, and that would suffice for your attendance. As you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. And if you need additional time, just ask me for an extension. I'll be happy to grant it to you. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class, putting closure onto our fiction section. Take care. Bye-bye.